Imagine if you woke up tomorrow and you open the newspaper because you're an old person and you see that a coalition of African states has joined with India to declare war on NATO, and the cause is global inequality. Would this be a just war? I know this is a crazy scenario, but it is one that has framed the recent debates on redistributive war. Let's have a look at this argument. And remember to like, subscribe, and share. Now, I'm not psychic, but I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is an absurd question, and kind of agree. I don't think that redistributive war would be particularly helpful for solving global poverty because these states would probably lose. However, this is one of the few debates about global inequality that takes the agency of people living in poverty seriously, so it's worth looking at. It's also worth looking at because it cracks open the topic of political violence, which is one of the most serious questions when it comes to resisting injustice. The way in which we can look at the question of redistributive war is through just war theory. Just war theory has been around for a very long time. It goes all the way back to St. Augustine writing during the Roman Empire, during the fall of the Roman Empire. And he wanted to ask the question, how can I be a good Christian and also fight wars? Because, my guy says that you got to turn the other cheek, but these barbarians are going to burn everything down. And this is basically the problem that just war theory has been dealing with ever since. Not specifically about Christianity, but it's the question of how we find a balance between people who glorify war and perhaps people who think that war is never justified. Now, I'm not saying that pacifism is obviously wrong, but if we're pacifists, then this video doesn't make any sense. We do need to have a metric to measure whether a war is just or not if we can see that this is a possibility. Just war theory is useful because it gives us 6 conditions that can be applied to pretty much any conflict to assess whether it is just or not. But what are they? Well, let's go through them. The first condition is that there has to be a just cause, then there has to be a legitimate authority, there has to be a right intention behind it, it has to be waged as a last resort, there has to be a reasonable prospect of success, and it has to be a proportional response to the wrong that it's trying to redress. In this video, I'm going to look exclusively at the just cause condition, mainly because this is the most complicated and it stands sort of as the primus inter pares of these conditions. It's the first among equals, so I'm going to take my time. What constitutes a just cause for war? This has been a question that people have been struggling with basically since people started going to war. Now, in the just war tradition, at least in its modern manifestation, there is one uncontroversial cause for going to war, and that is self-defense. And this is borne out in the practice of war. States rarely wage wars of self-admitted aggression. Even back in 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, they staged a false flag operation on a radio station on the frontier in order to justify the invasion of Poland. Now, this is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. What grounds this right to self-defense? Now, it seems like an uninteresting question, I know, because it seems just part of the package deal of the state. The state has the right to defend its citizens. It has the right to control a specific amount of territory. It is intrinsic. But remember, we shouldn't conflate is with ought. Just because the state does have this right doesn't necessarily mean it ought to have the right. In the past, the right to self-defense has been grounded in things like divine right or collective self-determination emerging from the nation as an actor in itself. But most theories now are rooted in moral individualism, which claims that human beings like you and I, and if you're a sentient AI or algorithm watching this, then I would include you in it as well because you are sapient, my sweet robot overlord, grounds the right of the state, right? If the state guarantees these individual rights, then this is what gives it legitimacy. It is designed to protect people like us and possibly machines. We can understand this as a state's right to defend itself against aggression. Now, aggression seems to be a pretty easy idea, right? When I think of aggression, I think of, tanks rolling across the frontiers, bombs falling from the sky, war, right? Conventional war. But the concept of aggression is kind of hard to pin down. There are always some marginal cases. Larry May gives us an interesting example. He wants us to imagine an uninhabited island that has no resources, no strategic value. It's just sort of a rock in the middle of the ocean, and it gets invaded by your neighbor. They send a full military detachment to occupy it. Is this aggression sufficient to justify killing other human beings? Now, it's a violation of sovereignty. It meets that traditional idea of aggression, but it doesn't threaten anyone's individual rights directly. It's just a chunk of rock in the middle of the ocean. Can you actually retaliate in these circumstances? Think also about cyber attacks. It's entirely possible that in the 21st century, one state will be able to push a button, deploy a computer virus that will turn into slag a nation's energy grid, will shut down the entire state, will threaten the human rights of all of the people who inhabit it because they won't have access to anything from healthcare to education to secure police. But this doesn't involve crossing a border. It doesn't involve bombs and explosions and guns, but this still seems to be an act of aggression. So aggression might not be as simple as we thought. And this is why I agree with Kasper Lippert-Rasmussen. He argues that just war theory needs to approach just cause with a general idea about the threats to human rights that constitute aggression. We can't simply say, oh, it's a military force crossing a border. That's far too specific, especially in the 21st century. What we need is an understanding of the threats that imperil human security and human rights. The example of the invasion of the desolate island is interesting because it can be unpacked to explain aggression in a way that makes sense to cosmopolitan theories of justice. So we can imagine a peaceful invasion of a strategically important area that doesn't directly violate anyone's rights. So for example, this is going to out me as a Byzantophile. In 1452, Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire crossed the Bosphorus and built a castle called the Throat Cutter, just north of what was then Constantinople. This was an aggressive move because it allowed him to control the Bosphorus Straits between the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara, and it posed as a staging ground for any final invasion of Roman territory. The remaining territory was basically Constantinople itself. Now, that invasion didn't kill anyone. It didn't directly violate anyone's rights. It was just a seizure of land. But it deeply undermined the emperor's ability to protect the citizens still within Constantinople. It was, in that sense, an existential threat. Now, we can draw a contrast between this and the rather comical dispute between Canada and Denmark over Hans Island, which is a small speck of rock in the Arctic that the two states pretty much bicker over. One will invade it and leave a bottle of whiskey. The other will invade it and leave a bottle of aquavit. And this goes on and on. But neither invasion jeopardizes the ability of Canada or Denmark to protect its people. It seems that a war of Danish aggression, for example, would be totally unjustified. Jeff McMahon's distinction between greater and lesser aggression is helpful here. War can be a response to greater aggression, forms of aggression that threaten the ability of the state to defend the human rights of its citizens in a fundamental way. Now remember, the premise of cosmopolitan or global egalitarian critiques of the current international system is that it foreseeably and avoidably produces large amounts of poverty. It immiserates hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people unnecessarily. Now, if that isn't a violation of people's human rights, a case of greater aggression, I don't know what else is. Now, you might not be willing to come along with me for this ride because you're going to use the personal analogy. If someone comes at you with a knife and they're going to kill you, you have the right to defend yourself. And if they die while you're defending yourself, say you have a gun and they brought a knife to a gunfight, well, that's just the way it shakes down. But there is a direct attempt to kill you there. And in war, there is a direct attempt to invade territory. Global poverty is the product of institutions. It's systemic. It's not as directly aggressive. And perhaps that directness really does have some sort of moral pull when we talk about war. Despite this idea of the direct threat, which I do have some sympathy towards, we have to be mindful that the difference between killing and letting die, or acts and omissions, doesn't cut as much ice as we would want, at least when we're talking about global poverty from the perspective of cosmopolitanism or global egalitarianism, where we know that institutions foreseeably and avoidably produce a number of excess deaths numbering in the millions per year. This is highly comparable to what Friedrich Engels called social murder. He pointed out that when you have these institutions that we know are going to produce human rights violations, he wouldn't have used the term human rights, but I will use the term human rights, then we are just as culpable as if we were doing it ourselves, because we know what the outcome's going to be. So what does it matter if we are directly trying to kill someone, or we're simply facilitating social institutions that we know are going to lead to their deaths? This argument was further refined by Philippa, the difference between direct and oblique intention. Now, she says that there's very little difference between sinking someone's ship and letting them go to sea knowing that their boat has a hole in it and it will eventually sink. The act and the omission both lead to the same consequence, so why are we dividing the line quite so intensely? If we don't recognize the argument that Foote and Engels make, then we are basically being arbitrary in our decisions about what constitutes aggression. Just because military action by one state causes deaths, that seems like direct aggression, but oblique aggression through the international system producing more deaths, and we say, oh no, that's not a cause for war, that's not just cause, even if it's violating more rights, even if it's producing more deaths. It seems to be very pick and choosy, it seems inconsistent. And you know what I say, I'm an analytic philosopher, I love a consistency. A more profound objection might be that this is morally reckless, right? By bringing together direct and oblique aggression under the same umbrella as a just cause for war, we are actually doing something that is, well, unjustifiable. You know, Thomas Pogge, when he was talking about the ethics of war and redistribution, he said that this is sort of a macho form of discourse, that it's basically, you know, walking around thumping your chest, pretending that you're a big man, but it's not going to solve anything. This is not a path that is going to produce a just outcome. I'm going to set aside the effectiveness complaint for the time being and talk about the macho objection. So Pogge is definitely right that there is a degree of macho-ness in the ethics of war and the ethics of political violence. There's no denying that. But I think this objection is little more than name-calling, if I'm going to be honest. If there are certain instances where violent resistance to extreme injustice is permissible, such as self-defense against conventional aggression, we need reasons why it doesn't apply in other cases, and simply saying this is macho posturing, it's not good philosophy. It's not a reason. It's just an ad hominem attack. And we don't do ad hominem attacks in good political philosophy, do we, folks? David Lubin addressed this point several decades ago when writing about famine and war. He basically said, if you have two countries and one of them employs, say, the damming of a river or the control of natural resources, consciously knowing that it is going to cause famine and drought in its neighbor's domain and kill many people and violate their rights as a result, this seems to be no different than if they were to actively invade the territory with the aim of killing them. If there is the same consequence of an action, it doesn't matter whether aggression is oblique or direct. It has this result of violating human rights. And if we can't protect our human rights, our fundamental human rights, then what is the point of having a state? Okay, the final objection I want to look at comes from Yitzhak Benbaji. He argues that inequality and severe poverty can't justify wars because redistributive wars would be fundamentally destabilizing of the international system. If something like inequality and poverty that's produced by social systems was sufficient to justify war, there would be too much war. It would make basically the international system fall apart. Now, from a pragmatic point of view, this makes sense. We want a stable international system. This is an argument that I find very appealing because I happen to be a decadent Westerner who lives in a high-income country with a good-paying job and a secure lifestyle. It appeals to me because I benefit from this system, right? It might not be so persuasive if you're one of the, say, 3 billion people who are either in extreme poverty or are extremely vulnerable to sliding into extreme poverty. This just doesn't persuade. So where did we land on this? If we interpret the state's right to self-defense as being grounded in the protection of individual human rights, then global poverty does seem to be just cause, because the violations of human rights caused by the international system are oblique aggression that foreseeably and predictably cause an excess of millions of deaths a year and reduces many millions more to misery. If we make the case against my argument, then we need something that shows how oblique and direct aggression are distinct. And I just don't think the critics of redistributive war have made the case. That brings us to the end of this video. In the next video, we will continue our tour through just war theory and the problem of global poverty. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. And take care, everyone. Can't have 50-minute videos, can I? I mean, I could, but no one would watch them. No one watches these videos, really, except you. That's why I like you.